very much looking forward to talking to you today. Can you, I guess, just tell us a little bit about how you're doing things differently?
Yeah, my pleasure. And it's an absolute privilege to be able to speak about this, because I think doing things differently is something I feel really strongly about. But can I have to start off with the question of, well, what do you mean by doing things differently? Is it about being a maverick? Is it about changing the status quo? Perhaps for me, it's more, I think, about charting a new path, finding a way through a problem or a challenge. And I actually think some of the presentations everyone's been listening to really kind of cuts a lot of those issues out there and puts it out there for a lot of conversation I hope that we're going to have next. It's actually, for me, doing things differently is exactly what this sector stands for. It's what it represents. We are often the engine and the catalyst for change, for seeing issues and wanting to do them differently, trying to tackle them differently. But that isn't always easy, and I'll come back to that. We are, in my opinion, the social glue. We are those who stand by the most vulnerable, the voiceless, and often the forgotten, and that they wouldn't otherwise receive support. So it's kind of on us, though, to think differently and to view people in that way. But why is it not easy to be different, do things differently? I think that is often the thing that can get in our way. So I actually think sometimes, and I think that's been covered a bit today, but it's our funding models often that stop us from being brave, for changing things, making different choices, because what if it doesn't work out? What if that changes how our organisation can function? What if it means our organisation doesn't exist if it doesn't work out? To change up our strategy and the risk that can carry is huge. And I think that has come up quite a bit today from what I'm gathering.
Yeah.
So doing things differently can often be seen as a luxury. And isn't that a bit of a concern, really, that the luxury to think differently and to be different actually can sometimes mean that you're conforming into those models? And I think particularly that can be an issue for managers and leaders to think in a way that, well, am I a CEO, am I a director, am I head? But also I need to be a social agitator. And sometimes those two don't exactly sit comfortably together, because you have to push and pull at the same time in different ways. And I think that can be really lonely and scary. You're kind of putting yourself out there in a position that doesn't always mean that you're saying something outside of, it's my gut instinct that's telling me this is the right thing to do. So let me go and find that data. Let me go and find out what that means. And I think knowing it's the right thing to do is a good starting point, though. That has to be the thing that you have to be able to start from. Does it meet something and a need that you've seen, an issue or a problem that you need to overcome? Because I think that's built into the DNA of the sector, I think part of the issue is funding, but also our governance structures. Some of our governance gets in the way, some of the hoops and jumps we have to go through, the knowledge sometimes we don't have sitting on our board to address those issues. And that kind of goes back to having to be that person to evidence, yeah, I think it's the right thing to do, but I need to find out what that looks like and why that is. So what if you're in a situation like I was in 2020 where you just don't have a choice? We had to do things differently. I had my back against the wall. I was like, right, what are we going to be? Who are we going to be? And what are we going to be to those who need us? What makes us something or an organisation that should exist? What gives us the right to exist anymore if it's not about actually addressing and tackling the issues that are for the future as well? What I kind of realised was that actually our new strategy had to be about connecting pathways of issues that are coming up that cross-sect with the work that we do, which, while my sector is animal welfare, so much of what we deal with is human stories, human issues, human challenges, people who are coming to us who own pets. And it was a bit of a realisation that for me, where there is a pet in crisis, there's often a person in crisis. So much of what we deal with is actually advice and support for people who are experiencing homelessness, about to lose their house, having to take on an extra job, losing a job, having a relationship breakdown, mental health issues, domestic abuse, you name it. What happens in society is often mirrored back in our organisations, and that was absolutely the case at Edinburgh Dog and Cat Home. I wanted to channel and chart a new path because actually those issues weren't sitting together. seeing the story of the pet and the person together, the ability for a pet to make someone feel seen and heard and loved in a way that actually as human beings we sometimes struggle to make connections with people. Pets cut through that. They make people feel that way. And actually, if you want to fight for something, you're going to fight for something that you love. And I don't wish on anybody to see someone who wants to keep their pet, a really important part of their family, to see them give that pet up because they haven't got a choice because of a crisis situation they're caught up in. And that's why we started to move into the issue of tackling pet poverty, talking about the community outreach and going out and actually preventing dogs and cats from leaving their homes in the first place to have to come to an organisation like ours. We are not the experts on those other social issues, but absolutely we can be a doorway. And my view was always, well, if someone walks through a doorway to get help, does it matter that it walked through a door to get help for their pet first? Absolutely not. And there's something about making those connections of what is it we're trying to do? What are we trying to benefit here? So I think really what I'm saying, and before I hand over to you guys again, is making those, there's so much to talk about here. I could talk all day about it, but making strategic connections that actually otherwise maybe wouldn't sit together. It's kind of our responsibility in this sector. To go back to the point about we're the social glue, we're the ones that see things, we spot things, we call it out and say that's not okay. So it's our responsibility to make those connections together. We have to take the sector, and I think there's been a big chat today about taking it in different directions, trying to find ways that we can right the wrongs, but also move with the times. The fact of the matter is that we are, all of us, under huge pressure. Our missions are absolutely creaking under the weight of the demand. Our teams are at capacity. They're feeling it. You can smell the burning from people. The burnout is really rife. But also funding. Funding's at crisis point, and there's a lot of conversation clearly being had today around where funding is sitting, where is it going. So really, what can we ever do? But we have to think differently. There's no other choice but to. So over to you guys, and really keen to keep talking about this.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I think, you talked about a kind of back against the wall moment. Are you able to expand on that anymore? Because, from what I understand of your story, it is pretty inspiring, but it is also just so unique compared to other situations. And it'd be great to hear a wee bit more about that, Lindsay.
Yeah, I've got a slightly controversial view on leadership during COVID versus the cost of living crisis. And I sometimes find myself harking back to the day of how much easier it was for me to make decisions with COVID. Because the reality with COVID leadership was I felt that my back was against the wall. I had a very, very simple situation of I have no funding, really, and I have an organisation that's nearly 140 years old, hugely important. But what does it mean to the world? What does it mean to the community? What are we doing? And the reality was that I was frustrated by watching people walk out the door and part with pets and to see things that I didn't want to see. I couldn't stand watching that. I wanted to be part of trying to change that narrative and seeing that situation for the better for those people and those pets. But the reality is actually when my back was against the wall in COVID, there was one straight line. It was one road. It was a Roman road. It was really easy to move through that because not at the time, but reflecting back on it, there is only one way to go. Actually, what's happened in the last 18 months is there is so many cul-de-sacs and different roads to have to go down. I'm having to question myself in a very different way about, okay, that feels different, but is that right different? Is the gut instinct there? Is the data there? Because it feels like there's so many roads and pathways right now with the cost of living crisis that's throwing decision-making into a completely different space. I almost feel that with COVID, there was only a few variables. And as simple as that makes it sound, I don't mean to dismiss that because that wasn't an easy time. And if I asked myself now, back at the time, I wouldn't have believed in myself. But actually the complexity of the social issues, how they've affected our staff, how they've affected the community, how they've affected our income, all of those issues. It's been like one thing after another. And that road has been far more complex from a leadership perspective than I could ever have foreseen. So yeah, it's a bit controversial, but back against the wall, maybe it makes you feel more like you're fight or flight. And perhaps moving forward where there's lots of ways you could go, it perhaps makes you question yourself more. That's not an easy thing as a leader.
I'm going to just come in and ask you to talk about the risk aspect. We've heard from Lewis this morning, Anna touched on it, around, as a sector, taking a lot more risks. You, for me, are somebody who is not risk averse. With the changes you've brought in, the work that you've done at the dog and cat home, and even to the funding, the way that you've funded, because I'm aware that you've kind of dabbled in cryptocurrency, you've gone out there, you've found alternative ways of doing it, because it was very much, this is what has to happen. It was the way that you were working. So from that point of view about actually doing things differently and turning things on its head, you are, for me, are kind of like a new breed of leader. You are a role model to be there for those of us who are kind of coming into this to say, right, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about doing things differently. So for me, that's about, my word would be brave, but how would you see that? What would be your word, Lindsay, around that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very unusual position to find yourself in, having to try and be brave and try and show that also to your team, because a lot of this is we're writing a story that hasn't actually got an ending yet. And I think that is in some ways exciting. I'm quite motivated by risk. I feel quite comfortable in a risky situation. I know that many of my peers and some of my team think that is terrifying. I think that there's a benefit to listening to your gut and knowing that could you in a year's time look yourself in the mirror and say, I did that okay to the best of my knowledge, and I'm okay with it. Risk, though, has to be calculated. I don't think that you can just throw past that at a wall and just think, well, hopefully some of it will stick. That's not the kind of risk that I think we're all talking about today. I think it's about saying, that's a problem, we're not fixing it. So what would be the worst thing that could happen if we changed how we saw that? Now, my board particularly were really nervous around the perception of our organisation looking like we were shifting away from what people loved us for, what people knew us for. And actually, we found many people who perhaps wouldn't have donated to us before were stepping forward and donating, because they said, well, actually, you're trying to be part of a solution to something that's far more complex than what I suppose has been traditional animal welfare within the sector. The reality, though, is risk is everywhere in our organisations. And I think that unless we're going to tackle the problems, we're just kicking cans down the road. And I don't know about you, but I really hate picking up cans that have been kicked down from other people. It's not in my patient's forte at all. So I think it's just the fact that we need to listen to our people. And those risks sometimes are about the fact that our people are our best barometers of what's annoying you, what's frustrating you, what's upsetting you, what are you hearing and what are you seeing. And that's the bit that I think we can be risky and play a bit with risk. But we're going to have to all be a bit collectively brave, and I think that is the right word for it, Maddie.
I think as well that the phrase that you used about not knowing the ending is really key. I think that comes out in the Lankelly Chase session, where it is that idea about, because there's so many unknowns and people don't know what's happening, then there is that fear factor because they don't know how it's going to end. So if I don't know how it's going to end, then I'm going to shy away from it. And what I'm hearing today, in particular from a lot of these sessions and from all our speakers, is that it's okay for us not to know what the ending is. It doesn't matter. It's all right. It's about, let's do it. As you're saying, Lindsay, it's not about just taking every risk that's possible. It's actually about thinking, well, what is it? What can we do? How do we take this forward? And it's okay if this doesn't work. Let's just give it a little go. Let's see what happens. Let's move this forward in incremental stages, which for me it's kind of like a safe risk, if that's not a misnomer. Sorry, Manish.
No, I was just going to say, I think Lindsay's done a great job of articulating this, and you've talked a few times, you've talked about going with your gut. And I guess another way to think about that is intuition. And I think what lots of people have talked about is intuitively almost knowing where to go, with things, and I don't think we do enough of that. I don't think we practice it enough. And I was going to ask Lindsay, like, how do you practice your intuition? How do you practice that gut sense? Because I get a sense you lead from there quite a lot, but it's a really hard thing to do. So I'd love if you had a few things that you tell us about things that you do in your own life and practice that helps you to be a leader that leads by intuition.
That's a really hard question to answer, because a lot of the time it's almost the counterbalance to leading to intuition is a lot of self-doubt. And it's a lot of actually, are you doing a lot of your own internal soul searching of, are you thinking right? A lot of the reflective kind of trying to work on your emotional intelligence of reading a situation, knowing that you're listening to the real issues as opposed to what you think they are. I think that there's a lot of us come in with pre-prescribed ideas of what we think something should be, and actually the reality can be very, very different. The gut and the instinct of you listening to your gut, and the intuition absolutely is a really good word for it. I don't think that happens also overnight. I think that you need to build a really good team around you who allow you to take the step back and to try and look at things in that way that's different, to trust the instincts. I absolutely love the idea of constantly trying to look to that next charted path and where are we going next. And that allows you to kind of sound out, am I right in thinking this way or am I wrong? And I think that's where it's almost practicing it before you get to the stage where you're sat there in front of your board of trustees, and what I had to do recently, and say, I know this is what we have to do, so I really need you to trust me on this part. But trust doesn't happen overnight, and you have to build that up as much as a relationship with anybody. It's a trust of your team and trust of your trustees. And your gut is not currency. So it doesn't mean that you just do that by just deciding you should do it. It's building it on the basis of you talking to other people. And I think this is where we've got an amazing sector who do talk to each other, who do share and open up. And I think every time I hear someone amazing speak, I'm like, that's just giving me such a great insight, because it is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So I don't think you can make a gut instinct decision or an intuitive decision without actually really understanding the lay of the land. Because we're all very good at putting our big feet into things, and actually that can be more damaging. But actually maybe we need a little bit more big feet thinking right now. Maybe because we're so caught up in annual funding models, 3-year funding models, you know, if we do it a bit too differently or a bit too scary, maybe that's not going to get us funding next time. That means I'm out of a job. It can become really quite granular, our thinking in that way. And actually, have we all not always come into the sector to think we want to do ourselves out of a job? Sometimes we get out of that way of thinking and we think, well, how do I keep making my organisation a success? How do I keep making it about what I'm doing? And I do think some of what's been talked about today is kind of going back to the core purpose. Why do you exist? And if it's not to try and change what you're doing, then you need to do it differently now. And I don't think our organisation should be around if it's not trying to do things that really connect the issues that we're seeing every day.
I like that big feet thinking.
I think it's a good place for us to end on, Lindsay, actually. Thank you very much. I think we've got a T-shirt out of today, Big Feet Thinking, or More Big Feet Thinking, and we've got a tattoo for us all to be getting from Lewis. So I think that's great. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for your input, and thanks for putting up with our technical difficulties. So thanks very much, Lindsay. It's been great. We're going to wrap up today. It's now come to that time. It's
sad.
Believe it or not, I know we made it. We've made it. We've made it here in the studio. You've made it here and online. So thank you so much. It's just really for me, some of the key things that came out were Lindsay, just the big feet thinking, social glue, which sticking plaster, you know, those are phrases that we've heard today. Working more in collaboration, taking more greater risks, using our guts more, and just really not being afraid of not knowing. So not being afraid of the unknown, and actually taking the plunge and moving forward. And words that we've heard about that proximity to privilege and power. And I think that was also in the Lankelly Chase about those of us who have got the privilege and power. It's about how we're using that and what we do with it. Absolutely. And putting money in the hands of the people who need it, not those deciding with the privilege and power where it goes to and how it's worked. So all of that really came out. And about how we move, I think your phrase was how we move from rhetoric to action, I think, for you. So Manish, what were your kind of What have I just? I've stolen
Just
all of your
taking all
things.
the good bits, but I think it's been such a insightful day, and I think I'm kind of going to go back and look at some of the longer form versions of some of these videos, because I think we've given you the 30 minutes, but there's actually even richer discussion in those hours, and I'd encourage people to even reach out to some of the people on these panels if you want to follow up some of these discussion points, because I think there's a lot of rich content out of today. But it means nothing if we don't actually do something with it. And I think there's been some good challenges from our speakers. So, I think, thinking back to Lewis and, all the way up there in Shetland today, and the work that they're doing at a really community level, but it has an impact, and I think don't underestimate what you're doing, no matter how small or how big it is, because actually it's really going to have an impact along the way. And I think we should get much better at collaborating and sharing practice, so I guess a challenge to all of us is how much are we putting the work that we're doing out there to be critiqued, but to be shared and to build better connections. Because I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's the fact that we can actually use technology. We're not that far away, and I think there's a lot that we can take from today into the work that we all do, regardless of what we're doing. So I've very much enjoyed listening to the speakers. I'm definitely going to take quite a bit away from you from today. And
Excellent.
Thank you for all taking the time to tune in.
Exactly. Thank you so much for coming. And I think that's about using AI for good was the other ones as well, about using that for good. Just very final thank you. Thank you very much to our podcast studio here in Glasgow, hosted by Podcast Studio Glasgow. They've been really warm and welcoming and friendly and helping us out today. And also Anywhere Plus, who've been the platform that you've been all watching and working and interacting with at home. So thanks very much to them. Thanks obviously to all of our sponsors, all of the people who hosted events at SCVO, and of course to our trusted SCVO staff who've been here in the studio with us, to Beth, Alec, Joanne at home, and Layla here. And of course, thank you so much to our speakers, Anna, Lewis, Sally-Ann, and Lindsay. I think that's everybody. And thanks to you, Manish.
Thank you to you, Maddie.
It's been a pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed my day.
It's been great. Same time again next year then, is it? If they'll have us back.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks.